Welcome to the Narrative Mindset Podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, I would appreciate it if you went back and viewed previous episodes when you get time to get the idea of the podcast. Loneliness is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives like fog, settling into the corners of your life until you realize you've been breathing it in for years. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps, filling the silence between conversations, stretching the hours of the night, pressing against the walls of your chest. You can be surrounded by people and still feel it. Because loneliness is not about absence. It's about disconnection. It's the gap between being seen and being understood. The distance between presence and intimacy. And when it lingers long enough, it becomes a lens, tinting everything you look at with its quiet ache. There are moments when loneliness feels almost cosmic, as if the sky itself is watching you. You look up at the stars, at the endless expanse above, and you realize how small you are, how fragile your connections really are. The eyes of loneliness are not human. They're vast, unblinking, external. They remind you that solitude is not personal, but universal, woven in the fabric of existence. And in that reminder, you feel both crushed and comforted. Because to be lonely is to share in something that every soul has known. Loneliness becomes a witness, a silent companion, watching you as you move through the world, waiting to see what you will do with its presence. The engine clicked once, a cooling sigh and the sudden absolute silence. I didn't turn the key further, didn't bother with the radio. I just let the weight of the shift, 11 hours of moving things, taken minimally, fixing problems that didn't belong to me, settling into the worn leather of the driver's seat. It was 2:17 a.m. I was parked outside a brightly lit, sickly yellow 24-hour convenience store on the edge of the Cass corridor. The streetlights here were old sodium vapor lamps, casting the entire scene in a bruised amber glow that seemed to filter out all warmth, but none of the grit. Detroit was quiet now, in the way only a massive, tired city truly knows how to be. It wasn't the silence of the wilderness. It was the silence of a packed room where everyone decided simultaneously not to speak. There was a low voltage hum, a collective breath held just out of earshot, full of potential energy and untold stories. I felt the city watching. Detroit doesn't watch with judgment. Judgment requires investment. And this town had long since cashed out of its emotional chips on my kind of quiet desperation. It watched with the pure, cool indifference of a seasoned bartender who's seen 1,000 men sit at the lonely end of the bar, nursing their fourth cup of coffee and their first regret. I sat there, an island of warm breath and cooling metal, while the city proceeded with its magnificent, ongoing act of existing without interruption. Loneliness wasn't new, We were old acquaintances. It had spent my childhood leaning against the closed door of my room, and my adulthood taking the passenger seat on long, empty drives. But tonight, loneliness felt like a shadow, and more like a membrane, invisible, taut, separating me from the oxygen of the world. The shift had ended an hour ago, but the emotional spiral began just 5 minutes prior. When I dropped off the last customer of the night, a young woman in her mid-20s, heading home after closing up a downtown bar. She'd been scrolling on her phone the whole ride, her face illuminated by the constant blue flicker of her screen. When we stopped, she looked up, suddenly noticing the quiet space we'd shared. She gathered her canvas bag, paused with her hand on the door handle, and her voice, casual and slight surprised, cut through the fabricated peace of the car. "You always this quiet?" she asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a question. Pure observation. But it hit me. A small, sharp chip of glass tossed into the still water of my composure. I gave her the practiced, low-effort answer, the one that required no vulnerability, only a functional noise. "Long day." She nodded, accepting the performance. "Yeah, me too. Have a good night." The door closed. She was gone, melding into the background noise of the street. But the question remained, echoing in the confined space of the cabin, the way sound bounces off concrete in an empty industrial building. "You always this quiet?" The answer, if I allowed myself the excruciating truth, was yes. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had, through decades of conditioning, learned that expressing the things that mattered most, the things that lay beneath the functional surface, was a dangerous liability. I grew up in the tradition of hard men, where silence was synonymous with strength. A man who needed nothing was a man who couldn't be broken. A man who spoke his feelings was, by definition, soft. And softness meant a weak point for the world to exploit. So I built walls, great, thick, soundproof ones, and I mastered solitude. I learned to cook for one, travel alone, and measure success by the sheer lack of need for external validation. I learned the trick of being physically present while emotionally absent. A ghost, I bring a body. But isolation, when mastered, ceases to be a defense mechanism and becomes an operating system. And sometimes, late at night, the operating system crashes, revealing the original underlying hunger. This wasn't about missing a person. I had people I could call. I had friends I could text. This was about missing the experience of being seen. The core self stripped bare of the day's necessary performance. Loneliness tonight wasn't a lack of company. It was the internal recognition that if I suddenly vanished from the parking lot, the story the world held of me would be entirely inadequate. It would be my functional biography, the job, the car, the apartment, none of the necessary, terrifying internal landscape. I am a man who tells stories, yet I am incapable of telling the most important story, the one about the effort required just to keep the mass steady. The air in the car was heavy, smelling faintly of stale coffee and road dust. I ran a hand across the stubble on my jaw. Loneliness, in its mature form, doesn't always bring tears or dramatic despair. Sometimes it's just the quiet, dull ache of chronic undernourishment. It shows up in the gas station aisles when I choose the exact amount of gas needed and avoid eye contact with the clerk. It is present in the silence after I click send on an email, realizing that the entire communication was transactional and clean of any true human mess. It is the weight of the unspoken. I found myself meditating on the core distinction between seeing and witnessing. People saw me all day. They saw the driver, the repairman, the confident. Sometimes when someone needed to offload their own mess quickly, they saw the controlled movements, the steady hands, the calm demeanor. That's seeing. But witnessing is seeing the blueprint, the internal scaffolding, the sheer muscular effort required to hold that calm demeanor in place. It is seeing the soft spot and choosing not to exploit it, but to acknowledge its existence. And what I secretly crave tonight, sitting here with the city breathing around me, was that witnessing. Not applause for my strength, but recognition of the fragility underneath it. I wanted someone to look through the sturdy glass of my self-containment and see the man inside. Exhausted, not from the shift, but from the relentless, solitary work of maintenance. It was the hunger to be observed without the reciprocal obligation to perform. That's the difficult bind of masculinity. We are rewarded for the armor, yet we die inside the suit. I looked out at the city. The lights of the distant central skyscrapers were pinpricks of defiant ambition. Down here, at street level, Detroit was the opposite of sentimental. The city understood, disappearing. It was full of people who had perfected the art of walking through the world with their burdens tucked neatly beneath their shirts, blending into the brickwork and shadows. Detroit didn't demand vulnerability. It demanded resilience. It was a place where people learned quickly that showing your hand meant losing the game. And so, the city's indifference was not cruelty. It was simply accurate reflection. If Detroit judged me, it would be for foolishness of waiting for a connection in the dead of night in an empty car. I had tried, in my own clumsy way, to make silence speak. That's why I told stories. Even if they were stories of other people, or observations filtered through careful lens. It was the only way I could risk sending a delicate, coded signal out into the void. I am here, and this is what it feels like. But when you finish the story, you are still the one who wrote it, and you are alone with the artifact. I put my head back against the headrest, closing my eyes, allowing myself 1 minute of pure, unadulterated fatigue. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the thin hiss of static coming from the radio. or forgotten frequency. That static, that was the sound of loneliness tonight. Not a roar of desperate mourning, but the constant low-level atmospheric interference that reminds you that you are just slightly, perpetually out of tune with everyone else. The tension of being strong and being soft was pulling me apart. I knew the softness was the truth. The core, the man who would look at the flickering neon sign of the convenience store and see not just advertising, but a desperate, lonely beacon of perseverance. But the strength was a survival tool. It was a legacy. What would it cost, truly, to open the door and step out of the car and tell a passing shadow just once, I'm tired of maintaining? It would cost everything. It would cost the carefully constructed identity of the man who can handle it. And perhaps that's why I stayed quiet, because the thing I craved, being utterly witnessed, was also the thing that felt most terrifyingly high stakes. I offered my true self, and I was met with that same cool indifference. The pain would be unbearable. Better the quiet, slow ache of isolation than the sudden, mortal wound of rejection. Better to be unseen than to be looked at, truly, and found wanting. I opened my eyes. The cold light of the 24-hour store continued its relentless glare. The young woman who had asked her simple question was long gone. The car was still. I reached for the key, not to restart the engine, but just to feel the cold, hard metal of the object that controlled my movement. I didn't want a solution. I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of the feeling. I was here. I was unseen. And for men like me, forged in the fires of necessary silence, that was sometimes just the required state of existence. The moment of mediation was over. The spiral tightened and resolved itself back into the necessary shape of functionality. The feeling of being witnessed was gone, replaced by the grim determination to simply endure. Detroit watched, and I didn't care. And in its indifference, there was a strange, cold comfort. I was free in this quiet, solitary cell to be exactly as complicated and as lonely as I needed to be, without explaining a damn thing. I turned the key, and the dash lights flared to life. Time to go home and park the car, only to carry the quiet into my apartment. The stillness broke, replaced by the low, familiar grind of the starter motor. I shifted into drive, pulling slowly away from the yellow light, carrying the weighty architecture of my solitude back toward the dawn. Loneliness doesn't vanish when you confront it. It shifts. It becomes less about emptiness and more about awareness. Less about isolation and more about recognition. To watch loneliness is to acknowledge its place in your life. To see it not as punishment, but as a teacher. It shows you the space where connection is missing, the cracks in your relationships, the truths you've avoided. And in that way, loneliness becomes a mirror, reflecting back the parts of yourself you cannot ignore. Perhaps the eyes of loneliness are not meant to judge, but to witness. They watch you as you stumble, as you reach, as you fail, and as you try again. They remind you that solitude is not the end of connection, but the beginning of understanding. To be watched by loneliness is to be reminded that you're still here, still searching, still alive. And in that searching, there's hope. Not the fragile hope of immediate companionship, but the deeper hope that even in solitude, you are seen. Loneliness may watch, but it also waits. And in its waiting, it leaves space for connection to return. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Narrative Mindset Podcast.